Man is the measure of all things, said Protagoras. Not everyone shared this opinion, even in ancient Greece, but it does represent a way of thinking which permeates Greek culture. From the beginning, Greek art is man-dominated to a greater degree than the art of any other civilization, and we can trace its development almost exclusively by looking at changes in the rendering of the human form. And that is how we shall be looking at Greek sculpture, particularly during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. This was the time of the fullest development of the Greek city-state, the classical age of Greece and of Greek art. This is a statue from the end of our period, or perhaps a little beyond, the late 4th century, the figure of a boy nearly life-size. The subject is uncertain. He may be pouring wine into a cup held in his left palm, but we can't be sure because the objects are lost. The statue was found in the sea off the Attic coast near Marathon, and it's in bronze. It is in many ways a typical classical statue with the elegance and freshness of an original from the circle of Phidias. The artist had aimed to make the figure look natural, lifelike, but the natural forms are simplified, and the action carefully adapted to an aesthetically harmonious design. The original concept of a statue in Greece was very different. These two larger-than-life-size youths in marble, known as Cleobis and Biton, were dedicated to Apollo at Delphi by the people of Argos about 600 BC. The type, which we know by the Greek word kouros, or youth, was constant in Greek sculpture from its beginning until the end of the Archaic Age, just before the Persian Wars. A naked youth, stepping forward with one foot, but otherwise symmetrically designed about a vertical axis, arms at the sides, no twist, turn, or bend. The kouros is the typical central type of archaic statue, though there are modifications and other types of male figure, as well as corresponding forms of draped female figure. The form derives from a much earlier Egyptian model, but there the weight is on the rear foot, and the figure normally wears a skirt. Egyptian artists weren't much interested in anatomy, and the type remains virtually unchanged for hundreds of years. The anatomy of these early Greek figures is shown in a very schematic way, but from the start it is clearly something which interests the artist, and in two ways. First in itself as a rendering of natural form, and secondly as a means of giving the statue a clear, formal, aesthetic pattern. This concern to produce a statue which will both give an impression of truth to nature and be an effective formal structure is central to the history of Greek sculpture. Here's one of the later kouroi, inscribed with the name Aristodicus. It must date very near 500 BC, about a century later than the Delphi twins. The basic composition is unchanged, but the forms are now much more like nature. Notice how the arms are joined to the thighs by struts. The artist, pursuing a natural effect, wanted to carve the arms free, not clinging to the sides as in earlier work, but was afraid they would break off. His followers were bolder, but it's clear why bronze, which has a much greater tensile strength than marble, became the favourite material in the succeeding early classical period. Aristodicus shows the furthest point Greek sculptors could reach while remaining content with the old kouros type, the traditional structure for a statue. But if Greek artists were to develop, not settle like Egyptian artists into the repetition of accepted formulae, they had to make some profounder change. So it was that early in the 5th century, what we think of as the classical revolution took place. This life-size marble figure of a boy was dedicated on the Acropolis about 480. The differences between this figure and a kouros are very slight but profoundly significant. The weight is on one leg, the other relaxed, so that hips and shoulders are no longer in parallel planes, and there's a very slight turn and bend to the head. The effect of the changes is perhaps more noticeable in the back than in the front view. A whole new world has been opened up to the sculptor in varieties of pose and in the contrast of taut and relaxed muscles. The Critian boy is a classical statue, not a kouros. This lovely head, called the fair-haired boy, from the colour which has faded since it was found, is from a similar statue. The carving of the neck shows that the bend of the head was more pronounced than in the Critian boy. There's a human quality, and the features display another more inward aspect of the change, the seriousness, the gravity of the new art. From now on, there is a continuous change and development in the treatment of the human figure, throughout the 5th and 4th centuries into the Hellenistic age. Within a few years of the classical revolution, Greek art had reached one of its great culminating moments in the sculptures of the Parthenon. The frieze is thought to reflect the style of Phidias, the outstanding artist of his time. Unfortunately, none of his freestanding statues have survived, so for the next stage in the development of the male figure, we have to look to Polykleitos, the other great sculptor of the period. His work has come down to us, but only in copies of varying quality. This is the most complete of many Roman marbles which reproduce his best-known work, the Doryphoros, the spear-bearer. The tree-trunk support is a typical telltale addition of the copyist. The freeing of the statue from the kouros pose has gone much further than in the Critian boy. There's a rhythmical character to the statue, a balanced contrast of straight and bent, of taut and relaxed limbs. And the rhythm is carried through into the structure of the torso. The lines defining the breast, belly and hips are given a quite unnatural clarity and heaviness, far more so than in the late Kouroi or the very early classical Critian boy. This was perhaps because, after sculptors had abandoned the archaic formality of pose, they felt the need to emphasize the formal pattern of the statue in some other way. By great good luck, we do have one superb original bronze of the early classical period, which was dredged up from the sea off the coast of Cape Artemision. It dates from the 460s. The powerful sense of form is combined with exquisite delicacy in the decorative but vivid handling of the hair and beard. The heavy braids bound round the head we met earlier in the fair-haired boy from the Acropolis, but by now it's an old fashion, probably confined to figures of gods and heroes. Mortal athletes wore their hair short. It must represent either Zeus or Poseidon, according to whether he was casting a thunderbolt or trident. It is not an original composition, but belongs to a tradition of small statuettes going back to archaic times. All the statues we have looked at so far have been of figures standing still. This is an action figure, and its main view is in profile rather than in full face. The difference lies not only in mastery of anatomical form, but in the balance of the powerful figure in motion. A little earlier than this, from the 70s, is the other great early classical bronze from Delphi, the famous and lovely charioteer. Apart from one arm, it is beautifully preserved. There's a silver key pattern on the headband and traces of copper inlay on the lips. The eyes, left hollow in the casting, are inset in coloured stone. The exquisite chiselling of the hair shows us how much we lose in even a good marble copy. This figure originally formed part of a group standing in a car drawn by 4 horses whose reins he held. He's wearing the long tunic of his profession. The deep vertical folds, almost architectural in their simplicity, conceal the bodily form beneath. They suggest the fluting of a column, but in no mechanical way. Cords at the back cross over to prevent the garment catching the wind during a race. But here the figure is still, and the whole group must have been quiet. The charioteer differs from all other figures we have looked at so far in one important aspect. He is clothed. There is a tradition of the clothed figure in Greek sculpture as old as the nude, but chiefly in figures of women. As a general rule, the male body is shown naked, even where nudity is not natural or appropriate to the action. Some of the horsemen on the Parthenon frieze, for instance. It's an artistic convention linked to the dominance in art of the human form over all other subjects. The convention, however, only applies to male figures. Alongside the earliest naked kuroi appear clothed female figures of extremely simple design. This, a larger-than-life-size dedication to Artemis, is one of the earliest Greek marbles we possess, and no doubt one of the earliest made, about the middle of the 7th century. A lovely small figure dedicated to Athena on the Acropolis a century or more later shows how this simplicity could be developed with great subtlety. The shape of the female body is emphasized by the simple, clinging dress known as a peplos. There's a real sense of a living form here. The quality of this archaic work is outstanding, but it is in fact a type as constant as the kouros and known as a kori or girl. During the 6th century, a new fashion and sculptural treatment of drapery was introduced. This little figure, also from the Acropolis, just before 500 BC, is typically late archaic. Prettiness and a fascination with elaborate drapery are the hallmarks of this style. And as we noticed in the male figure, there's also a new serenity, which is an important aspect of the coming change from archaic to classical. A large torso, again from the Acropolis, shows how the late archaic sculptor experimented with drapery, using it to reveal the body and giving it a life of its own when it hangs free. In contrast, early classical sculptors build on the armature of the body a severe design of almost architectural simplicity. This statue of a goddess is preserved in several marble copies. the treatment of the face and hair are so like those of the bronze god from the sea that the original must surely have been from the same school or hand, and also in bronze. As in the charioteer, the fluting of the skirt is emphasized like a column, though it looks rather mechanical compared with that marvellous work. Many small bronze statuettes have the same character, and a freshness which the copyist's marble lacks. Particularly beautiful is this one from Delphi, supporting an incense burner. The fluting of the skirt is looser and freer than in the previous figure, and is broken by one knee. The broken fluted skirt remains a favourite device right through to the classical era, modified in different ways by different generations of artists. From the late 5th century we have splendid examples in the caryatids of the Erechtheum. Because of their architectural function, the sculptor has made them stand with an almost archaic frontality. There seems a touch of deliberate archaism, too, in the braided hair, and in the way the skirts are held to one side, as one sees in the back view. One could hardly find a sharper contrast with the caryatids than the magnificent victory dedicated to Olympia and signed by the sculptor Paeonius. It's probably a few years earlier than the caryatids, but the difference in style has nothing to do with the difference of date. We see a return to the preoccupations of late archaic sculptors in a fascination with the play of drapery and its relation to the body, in places closely modelling the limbs, elsewhere flying free in a life all its own. The effect, however, is totally transformed by the profound understanding of the human body in movement. In early archaic art, swift movement was indicated by a kind of hieroglyph, the position of legs and arms approximating to a swastika. This figure, also of a winged victory, was supported free of the base by the drapery between the legs. By the end of the archaic period, a more natural movement had been mastered, as in this charming little girl from Eleusis. But with Paeonius's figure, we are in another world. The bird under her feet shows that she is in flight, but we don't need it to tell us that. The statue is actually supported by the mass of the blown-back skirt, a sophisticated development of the motif in the archaic statue. A cloak held in both hands flew out above, and that in turn was topped by the open wings. But despite the losses of these essential elements in the composition and the loss of the face, the combined effect of power and grace remains extraordinary. This new style seems foreshadowed in some of the sculptures of the Parthenon. Carved in the 40s and 30s of the 5th century in the circle of Phidias, the Parthenon pediments show better than any other kind of sculpture that has come down to us the culmination of the classical style. At the same time, they seem to hold the seeds of later styles like those of Paeonius. In these great goddesses from the east gable, we can see how the drapery is used to model the splendid forms beneath, and also to build rich and satisfying patterns of its own. They are quiet figures. The daring movement of Paeonius's victory is more nearly approached but not reached in this figure of a young goddess, though her drapery is much simpler. Or there's the lovely ruin from the other gable, the winged iris. Both pediments also show magnificent male nudes. The large, simplified forms, the vivid transitions tell us, as well as anything that survives, what classical sculptors were trying to do with the human body. The new clinging drapery style evolved on the Parthenon and magnificently developed in the victory of Paeonius, allowed artists to model the female body as though naked while preserving the convention of a clothed statue. Having reached this point, they made another break, and completely naked female statues began to appear in the 4th century. This naked Aphrodite was the most popular statue in the Greco-Roman world. It was also the most famous work of the great 4th century sculptor Praxiteles. He adhered to convention as far as motivating the nudity, by suggesting that the goddess had been surprised bathing. Here the water pot and clothing are integral parts of the statue's original structure, not additions by a Roman copyist. The copies of this masterpiece are poor things, but they do show us that Praxiteles' creation of an ideal feminine nude was a much more radical departure from tradition than simply leaving off the clinging clothes and paying more attention to surface subtlety. Earlier statues of women tended to stand as foursquare and firm as their male counterparts, and their proportions were often similar. But in the Aphrodite, the sloping shoulders and broad hips are emphasized by the shrinking, stooping movement. The water pot and lifted garment serve both a practical and an aesthetic purpose as a support for the rather unstably posed statue. This was a truly new creation of a feminine ideal in sculpture to match the old masculine one. But it's hard to get much aesthetic pleasure from these copies. We can get a better notion of the quality of 4th century sculpture by looking at one of the great marble gravestones fashionable in Athens from the time of the Parthenon until the end of the century. This beautiful piece is late after the middle of the 4th century and displays something deliberately avoided by earlier artists, a new quality of tenderness. This gravestone, or stele, which is a little later than the previous one, shows also the new proportions which come in at this time. The limbs are longer. Heads become smaller. These changes are associated by ancient writers with the name of another great 4th century sculptor, Lysippus of Sicyon, who became court sculptor to Alexander the Great. Apart from stelae, Lysippus seems to have worked exclusively in bronze, and his most famous statue, the Epoxyomenos, is preserved in marble copies as poor as those of the Aphrodite, but, like them, informative. All the statues we have looked at so far have been designed for a single primary viewpoint. So also, perhaps, this. But the arm brought across the body, the other raised abruptly forward, break up the traditional harmony of contour and emphasize a new tendency to naturalism, present also in the momentary movement, the weight seeming to shift between the wide-set feet. Both these tendencies, to naturalism and to emphasizing the third dimension so that the statue seems to invite one to walk around it and look at it from other angles, are both fully developed in the following Hellenistic age. Many Hellenistic statues are cunningly designed for all-round views. The most exciting example to survive is the wonderful little bronze jockey made around 100 BC. Naturalism and many-sidedness grow easily out of the late classical style, but they are foreign to its highest manifestations in the 5th century. To see how far we have come from that time, we should glance back at the great bronze god found in the same wreck as the jockey, but made nearly 400 years earlier, and observe again the single dominant viewpoint and the grand idealization of form and feature. This is classical sculpture.
The sea, which washes the long coastline and numerous islands of Greece, brought our people into contact with each other from very early times. When Sophocles celebrated man's unique achievement, he placed mastery of the sea first.
Many marvels there are, but none so marvelous as man. Over the dark sea he rides, in the teeth of the winter storm, driving through towering spray.
What kind of ships were they in which the Greeks traded across the Ionian Sea and with their colonies in the west? What ships took part in the Battle of Salamis or fought each other in the internal wars of the 5th century? There were two distinct types of Greek ship, the long and the round, the warship and the merchantman. The contrast between the two is very clear on this black figure cup in the British Museum. Both have masts amidships, a single square sail, and landing ladders. But there the resemblance ends. The warship, its oars arranged on 2 levels, glides through the water with its deadly ram ready to strike on the waterline. The merchantman sits deep in the water and relies on its sail. The largest ships were too heavy to beach and had to be towed in and out of harbour. The gangplank is carried astern because such ships were moored stern to the shore in what is still known as the Mediterranean moor. Ships like this sailed all over the Mediterranean, but we knew very little about their construction until a major discovery was made off the coast of Cyprus at Kyrenia by the marine archaeologist Michael Katsev.
We were searching the coast of Cyprus for ancient shipwrecks and found several in the autumn of 1967, but our most important find we were led to by Andreas Cariolo. Several years earlier he had discovered the site of the Kyrenia ship and very kindly took us to it. What we saw was a mound of amphoras, ancient wine jars, and immediately we realized that what was there was intact. We surveyed it, roughly determined its size, but the most important thing was that we were able to ascertain its date by the distinct shape of the jars that form part of the mound. The jars dated to the 4th century BC, and there was no other ship of this period, so we realized its importance and the necessity to undertake its excavation. The first year's work was simply a survey lasting 1 month. In 1968 and 69, during the entireties of the summer, we excavated the ship using a crew of over 30 divers each summer.
It was soon discovered how delicate the timbers were, and so too were the fragments of lead covering the hull. Each piece of wood was identified and mapped before being brought to the surface. The wood had the consistency of soft sponge, and the outer planks were riddled with ancient sea worm, in spite of the lead plating. It had to be thoroughly washed and preserved before an accurate reconstruction could be undertaken, from the stereoscopic photographs on the seabed and several thousand full-scale drawings of the timbers. Ancient ship construction is very different from that of modern ships, and in order to determine the ancient techniques, a full-scale model was made of a section of the hull.
Kyrenia ship was built as we believe most ancient ships were in antiquity. The keel was first set down on waves, and then the outer hull was completely built up, the shell of the ship. In this case, each plank was edge-joined next one to another, and the means by which each plank was joined edge to edge was by cutting mortises in the edge into the mortises, setting tenons. The upper plank was then set down on the plank already in place, and so the entire shell was built up. Only after the shell was completed did the shipwright shape his frames and set them into the hull, acting as inner reinforcing in order to give the hull even greater strength.
In the reconstruction, the ancient technique had to be reversed, because the timbers had been flattened under the weight of the cargo and so lost their original shape.
We have learned a great deal about the design and configuration of the hull. One particular thing I might mention now is that the keel of the Carina ship was curved, and this certainly would have given her very good steerage way, as also a good hold in a reaching sailing leg. We also have found a number of pieces of the standing and running rigging for which there are no parallels from the Greek and Hellenistic periods. We found a steering oar down in the stern area. We believe that this steering oar is in fact a spare. The reason we believe it a spare is because we found no evidence as to how she was lashed or held on board. From the steering oar and also from the mast step, we begin to understand somehow how she was sailed. We believe that she had a single square sail. Our main reason for concluding this is because in the stern, in a locker, we found over 300 lead rings. We believe these are part of a spare sail. These lead rings cannot be associated with any kind of fore and aft rig, but really only effectively work with a square sail. And when we tested it with our fiberglass miniature Mata, we found that she did in fact sail very efficiently with this square sail, and it was amazing how close she could point into the wind.
The Kyrenia ship would have made about 4 or 5 knots in favourable conditions. She was about 15 metres long, probably average for merchantmen in our period. She carried between 20 and 30 tons of cargo. Heavy cargo ships that could not be beached required harbours protected from prevailing winds by moles and from land attack by defensive walls. As Corinth had 2 harbours, she was forced to build walls miles in length to connect them to the main city and Acrocorinth. Corinth grew rich partly because she used her commanding position to control shipping taking a short cut across the isthmus, and so avoiding the projecting fingers of the Peloponnese. In modern times, the Corinth Canal provides easy access from the Corinthian to the Saronic Gulf. The Diolkos, a paved track, ran across the isthmus on much the same lines. Ships, both merchantmen and warships, were dragged along the track on trolleys. The ruts made by the wheels are still visible, 1.5 meters apart. The track is paved with huge poros blocks incised with Corinthian lettering of the early 7th century. There may have been some sort of loading or road signs. In 1956, part of the track was excavated by Dr. Verdelis. He found evidence of superb engineering, and where the tracks curved steeply, there were low ridges to hold the trolley wheels in place. But we can only guess at the mechanical contrivances employed to operate it. From ancient references, we know that the Diolkos was used in the Peloponnesian War. Indeed, it was still in use in the 9th century AD. Like Corinth, Athens in the 6th century was a considerable sea power, but her fleet was subsidiary to her army. Themistocles' policy was to transform Athens into the strongest sea state in Greece. He used the threat of Persian naval activity to persuade the Athenians to move their warships from the open beaches of Phaleron, where they were within sight of the Acropolis, but unprotected from any sudden attack. Themistocles removed the ships to the safety of the natural harbours of Piraeus, which he fortified with walls. The narrow entrance channels could be closed with chains. The fortifications were started 3 years before Marathon, and finished after the Persian invasion. Later, Athens herself was connected to Piraeus and the sea by her long walls. Modern Piraeus has overlaid or destroyed most of the harbour installations of ancient Athens. Then, as now, Kantharos was the main commercial harbour. Here the fleet assembled for the ceremonial departure of an expedition at a special jetty. In an emergency, the presiding committee of the Assembly met on the actual jetty and stayed in continuous session until the fleet set sail. The fleet was kept in the smaller harbours of Munichia and Zea. Ships of the line were kept out of the water when not in use and under cover to protect them from sun and rain. The shore of the circular harbour of Zea is fringed today by pleasure craft, as in the past it was fringed by Athenian warships in their ship sheds. Remains of slipways cut in the rock can still be glimpsed at the water's edge. 196 ship sheds once fitted into this harbour. Perhaps the comic writer wasn't joking when he put the dockyard first among the glories of Athens. Rigging and other gear was kept in the dockyard storerooms, and in the later 4th century in the famous arsenal built by Philo. Not a stone of the building remains, but an inscription enables us to make a reconstruction. This building was a source of great pride, as were the actual ship sheds. The slips were partly cut in the bedrock and partly built up with stones to make a gentle gradient into the sea. The model shows 3 pairs of slips. The space between the columns was only 19 feet 6 inches in the Zea sheds, and even less in the Munichian ones. The stone slips extended about 120 feet from the water's edge. They also continued under the water, and slight changes in sea level since antiquity must be taken into account when estimating the original dry length of the slips, and so the length of the ships they housed. This explains nautical archaeologists' preoccupation with shipshed dimensions. Unfortunately, the evidence for the Zea shipsheds comes from a rescue excavation of 1885, and very little can be seen today. The shipsheds provide the maximum dimensions for the trireme, which in the absence of an actual ship is very important. It cannot have been longer than 120 feet, and to clear the columns either side, not more than 12 feet 5 inches in beam, with outriggers projecting 2 feet on either side. The trireme had to be light enough to be manhandled by its crew. Warships from earliest times had to be beached stern first because of their projecting rams. Their crews, if possible, dragged them out of the water each day and camped in the shelter of the upcurving sterns. This little model from the Acropolis of Athens dates from the 4th century and is one of our very few three-dimensional models of a warship. Trireme means 3-fitted and refers to the disposition of the oars. But unfortunately, there's an almost complete absence of representations of a trireme in the 5th and 4th centuries. The Lenormand relief, also found on the Acropolis, is the only one showing oars at 3 levels. This has been used for many reconstructions, but no satisfactory model has been devised which allows the lower oarsmen room to complete their strokes. Fortunately, it's a carefully worked out relief. The delicate carving brings out the light superstructure of the Greek warship. The thole pins of the topmost oars are carried by an outrigger, while the lower oars pass through ports cut in the hull. In our period, the crews were drawn from the poorer citizens and resident aliens, and rode naked on leather cushions, shielded from the sun by the deck. As a man-powered missile, the trireme had to outspeed and outmaneuver its opponent. It was kept out of the water when not in use because a waterlogged hull reduced speed. A 19th century drawing of the Lenormand relief shows the bronze ram, designed to hold the enemy at or a little below the waterline. For other supporting evidence, we are reduced to an ornamental drinking cup and a coin. But we do know from the literary evidence that everything was designed for lightness, apart from the keel, which was of oak to withstand the wear and tear of hauling up the beaches. Because it was so lightly built, with no cargo or ballast to preserve and mark it out on the seabed, we are unlikely ever to find the remains of a trireme. But we do know the location of many sea battles. Engagements take place close to the land, the slower ships seeking confined water, the faster room for manoeuvre. A famous tactic was the Diekplus, a single line of ships passing through the enemy fleet drawn up line abreast to attack from the rear. To counter this, the slower fleet would form a circle round its supply ships, rather like the ring of wagons before an Indian attack. These naval tactics are well illustrated at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. In 429, the Athenian general Phormio was guarding the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth with 20 ships when 47 Peloponnesian warships plus other vessels approached. The faster Athenian fleet allowed them to reach open water before attacking. To prevent an Athenian Diekplus, the Peloponnesians made the classic response. Then the Athenians circled the enemy fleet, a maneuver known as periplus, until, aided by the wind, they reduced it to confusion. Thucydides describes the scene.
Ships fell foul of each other and had to be pushed off with poles. With the shouting and swearing and yelling from one boat to another, it was impossible to hear the orders being given by the boatswains. Lacking experience as they did, the Peloponnesians couldn't clear their oars in the rough sea, making the ships more difficult for the steersmen to handle. Then Phormio gave the signal. The Athenians attacked, and after first sinking one of the admiral's ships, went on to destroy every ship they came across.
Athenian naval tactics were based on well-trained crews, faster ships, choice of sea for engagement. When these conditions were not fulfilled, as at Naupactos a month later, or at Syracuse in 413, she could be in trouble. Despite her long, indented coastline and numerous islands, Greece has few natural harbours. Ships hugged the coastline where possible, anchoring or beaching each night so the crews could eat and sleep ashore. Naval warfare and trade were seasonal activities from May to September because of the risk of bad weather. From discoveries on land, we can plot the extent of ancient trade. Amphoras, the barrels of the ancient world, carried wine, olive oil, dates, fish, and inedible substances like pitch. We don't know whether the cargo of the Kyrenia ship was typical or not. She certainly carried large quantities of amphoras, identified by their shape as from Rhodes and Samos, both places renowned for their wine. She also carried blocks of volcanic stone carefully carved with slots. They were finally identified as the remains of a cargo of millstones quarried on the island of Nisiros. And there were nearly 10,000 almonds, perfectly preserved. From this cargo, we can trace the probable course of her last voyage. Leaving Samos, the ship sailed to Nisiros, taking aboard the millstones, and then to the island of Rhodes. Perhaps some of the millstones were traded here for the 300 amphoras of Rhodian wine. The captain may have hoped for buyers further east, perhaps in Cyprus, which was famous for its almonds, or even beyond. But when did the Kyrenia ship go to the bottom? Professor Katsif.
The first clue that we had for dating the shipwreck was from the shape of the amphoras, and particularly the Rhodian amphoras. Rhodes, over antiquity, changed the shape of its amphoras, and these have been very carefully studied so that we can now tie in those amphoras manufactured on Rhodes that were found in the Kyrenia ship to the period between 330 and 300 BC. Like all archaeological sites, though, the best clue for dating is the numismatic evidence. We found only a few coins, a few bronze coins, in the Kyrenia ship. These, fortunately, can be read, and further reinforce that the ship must have sank in the latter part of the 4th century, perhaps as late as 300 BC.
Other finds in the wreck, in particular the mass of kitchenware, provide information about the crew and shipboard life.
We found no evidence for any decking amidships in the Carina ship. However, we have found evidence for storage areas fore and aft. And in these areas, we have found the crockery that was used by the crew. Especially in the stern area, we found a large number of vessels used by them. 4 different bowls of the same size, 4 oil jugs, 4 pitchers to pour into for canthroy, wine cups, and finally we've also found fragments of 4 wooden spoons. It seems to me that the conclusion is inescapable, that we are dealing with a ship that was manned by a captain and 3 sailors. We've also found quite a bit of material to tell us what they ate. Grape seeds, hazelnuts, olives, fig seeds, and we've also found a fragment of a garlic clove. Besides this organic material, I think we can also conclude that they must have eaten fish on board, for we found over 300 weights of lead that must have been attached to a fishing net, and we've also found a hook that would have been used to catch fish. We have found other implements that they would have used for cooking. Here, for instance, is a large copper cauldron, perhaps the communal cooking vessel. And in order to spoon the contents from the cauldron or the castle, they very possibly used a very handsome bronze ladle that we found.
We shall never know for certain why the Kyrenia ship sank. Underwater excavation is a prolonged and costly business, and it will be many years before other key sites have been found and fully excavated.
In antiquity, the nation that controlled the seas could control her destiny. In the classical and Hellenistic periods, it was Greece who held that power. We had little knowledge of her warships and her merchant marine. But with the discovery of the Carina ship, its excavation and reconstruction, we have now, through this one example, been able to contribute an immense amount of knowledge. And we hope that by reassembling her, students and scholars will be able to come and study the remains and learn even more about the ships and the seafaring that were so important in antiquity.